Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about wet pallets. Are they a gimmick or an essential tool? Alright folks, welcome back. Today's video is partly inspired by a couple of conversations I've had recently, but primarily it's in response to a question from WSKS FM Worldwide 5390, great handle by the way, who asked me, wet pallets, are they just another gimmick or are they actually an essential tool for miniature painters? Now, it's a really good question actually, because wet pallets have been around for a long time, and you know, they've been around in particular over the last few years. You know, lots of companies have produced them, and every time you see a tutorial from a pro painter on YouTube or elsewhere, odds are they're working off of a wet pallet, and that can make you wonder, if you're not using one, are you somehow missing out? Or is it just another case of hobby FOMO, where everyone rushes to buy the latest must-have gadget before quietly realising actually it's not magic after all? So let's break it down. What exactly is a wet pallet and why do people use them? Well, at its simplest, a wet pallet is just an airtight container with a damp layer of something absorbent at the bottom. Kitchen roll, sponge, that sort of thing, covered with a semi-permeable membrane, usually baking parchment or a special paper that comes with the commercial varieties like this one. The whole idea is that you keep this moist so the paint that you put on the top doesn't dry out quickly. Now, for those of us working with acrylics, which can dry out incredibly fast on a normal dry palette, this can be quite appealing. Instead of your carefully mixed highlights drying out into a crusty blob 5 minutes after you put it down, a wet palette keeps the paint workable for hours, sometimes days. So as you'd expect, I'm going to start this conversation by looking at the potential benefits in more detail before discussing the negatives, and then trying to come to a reasonable conclusion, if I can, at the end. Now, spoiler alert, some of you may not like my conclusion, but I don't think it's giving much away when I suggest using a wet palette is a bit like Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. Now, as I said in the introduction, the basic concept of a wet palette is that it keeps the paint workable for much longer. And for painters who like layering, glazing or any kind of wet blending, this is a huge deal. Acrylic paints dry fast by design, which is why they're so convenient, but that can be a curse if you're trying to blend smoothly across the figure. A wet palette keeps the paint at just the right consistency for longer, so you're not constantly remixing colours, wasting paint or fighting against the clock. So let's look at some of these benefits in a little more detail. First, and this is the one that people notice straight away, proponents of wet palettes claim that it massively reduces waste. Now, if you're working on a dry palette, you put down a few drops of paint, you thin them out of water, and you've got maybe 10 minutes before it's dried, maybe flaky and useless mess. On a wet palette, that paint can last the whole session. It's even possible to come back to paint the next day and find the same colours still usable. That's brilliant if you're mixing custom shades. You don't want to have to recreate your perfect Prussian blue from scratch every time you sit down. Second, a wet palette is just better for thin paint technologies. If you're into glazing or subtle highlights, the semi-permeable paper helps keep the paint thinned down to a milky consistency. You don't have to constantly dip your brush in the water and then risk making the paint too runny or uneven. It keeps that balance nice. Now, I should add, this is anecdotal. I've not used them like this, but it's one of the benefits that regular users often cite. Third, it's a lifesaver if you're painting in a hot or dry environment. I know a lot of people in the States or Australia who say without a wet palette they just couldn't paint for more than half an hour in summer because everything would dry solid. Even here in the UK, famous for being wet and grey, the summers have been anything but in recent years. Painting when the humidity is low and the temperature is high equals paint that can dry much faster than you'd expect. Using a wet palette just keeps everything workable for longer. But of course, nothing is perfect. Wet palettes also come with a set of drawbacks that the proponents often don't discuss, but I think they are actually worth talking about. Now, the first and most obvious one, not all paints behave well on wet palettes. Metallics are the classic culprit. If you put a nice silver or gold down on a wet palette and leave it, it often separates into pigment and binder. And when you come back, you've got a weird grainy mess instead of shiny metal. The same goes for contrast paints or speed paints or technical paints like washes and texture paints. They don't really sit properly on a wet palette. They just separate or dilute way too far. And oils obviously are completely incompatible. They don't mix with water, so wet palette is just pointless there. Another limitation is overhydration. If you're not careful, you can end up with paint that's too thin because the paint paper has absorbed too much water. Suddenly your lovely smooth coat has turned into a watery glaze you didn't ask for. Pigments can separate, colours can shift, and you end up fighting the tool instead of being helped by it. Now, that's a maintenance issue as much as anything, and I found that keeping the palette topped up but not drowned is a bit of an art form in itself. And here's the clincher for me: wet palettes are not suited to every style of painting. If you're batch painting an army using quick techniques like slapchop or dry brushing, you probably won't get much benefit from a wet palette. You're working fast, you're not trying to keep the same mix alive for 3 days, and the biggest worry you've got is whether you can get the second colour on before the first one's dry. For that kind of painting, a dry palette or just a dollop of paint straight out of the pot is often quicker and a lot less fuss. And for painters like me that tend to lean heavily on strong highlights and shade washes, the subtlety of more refined blending techniques which benefit from a wet palette is a little bit lost. So who does a wet palette really benefit? Well, the obvious group, as I've suggested, are painters who love smooth transition and careful layering. If you're trying to go from deep shadows up to bright highlights in a seamless transition, a wet palette would give you the control you need to keep those mixes usable. It's also fantastic for painters who work over several sessions. If you don't have the luxury of finishing a model in one go, but you want the colours to match perfectly the next time you sit down, a wet palette keeps those mixes alive so you don't have to play colour chemist every single time you sit down to paint. And then there's the environment factor. If you live somewhere dry or hot, or you're painting under hot studio lamps, a wet palette can feel like a lifesaver. On the other end, who can probably skip using a wet palette? Well, if you're a speed painter, knocking out units quickly and not worrying too much about ultra smooth blends, then honestly it might just slow you down. Army painters who aim for a good tabletop quality but don't necessarily need the subtlety of 20 layers of highlights will probably also feel that a wet palette is a bit pointless, frankly. Likewise, if you're slapping down big amounts of paint for an airbrush, base coat or terrain piece, the little puddles on a wet palette are just too small to be practical. And as I mentioned, if you rely heavily on specialist paints like metallics or contrast paints, you'll find you need a dry palette anyway. All of which brings me to alternatives and hybrid approaches. A lot of painters actually use both. They will keep a wet palette for their standard acrylics and blends, and they'll also have a cheap plastic dry palette nearby for metallics, washes or contrast paints. That way you get the best of both worlds without constantly fighting against the quirks of certain paint types. There are also disposable dry palettes, those pads of waxy paper you can buy cheaply, which are great for travel or quick sessions where you don't want the fuss of keeping a wet palette maintained. And speaking of maintenance, let's touch on the DIY versus store-bought debate. You can make a wet palette at home with a Tupperware box and a bit of sponge and some baking parchment. It costs pennies. Or you can buy a fancy commercial one with replacement sheets, sealing lids and all the trimmings. The expensive ones are convenient and look nice, but at the end of the day, the function is exactly the same. Whether you're a budget hobbyist or someone who likes a polished product, there's an option out there for you. Now, I want to be really clear here and lay my own reputation on the line. A wet palette is a tool, not a rule. It's not a badge of honour, it's not a rite of passage, and I certainly don't believe you're not a lesser painter if you don't use one. For some people it's revolutionary, for others, myself included, it's just an extra bit of faff that you don't need. The key is figuring out whether it suits your painting style and your environment, and the only way to really know that is to try one. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've bought a wet palette a few years ago and I used it for about 6 months, and in the end I just couldn't get along with it. For me it became more of a hindrance than a help. It needed constant checking to make sure it wasn't drying out, or worse, getting too soggy. I don't paint every day, and I often found that when I came back to it, the palette was either dried into a crust or had sort of developed a faint whiff of swamp life. Maybe that was my fault for not maintaining it properly, but the truth is it just didn't fit with the way I paint. So when I sit down, I want to paint, not spend 10 minutes cleaning mould out of a Tupperware box. So in the end I just went back to my trusty porcelain dry palette, and I've been perfectly happy ever since. Now, of course, that's not to say that wet palettes are bad. I know painters who swear by them and who honestly couldn't imagine working without one. And that's really the point. It's about personal preference, not universal rules. At the end of the day, whether you use one or not, the important thing is still the same. Keep painting, enjoy the process, and don't feel pressured into thinking you need every single gadget to be a proper miniatures painter. Wet pallets are useful, but they're not the magic key to painting success. They're just another tool in the box, and whether or not you reach for it is entirely up to you. So what do you think? I mean, I know that Ken Riley of the Yorkshire Gaming Podcast isn't a fan, but what about you? Have you tried a wet pallet and decided it's just not for you? Or are you one of those people who fell in love with them straight away and now wouldn't go back? And if so, do you have any hacks or tips for keeping one maintained without the swamp monster moving in? Or are you wondering what all the fuss is about and that bit of scrap wood you've been using to mix your paints on is just fine? As always, I'd love to hear your experiences, your preferences and your tips in the comments below. So that's it for this week. As always, please join in the conversation. And if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. And you may also want to consider joining as a channel member for extra content. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course keep rolling high.